Sometimes motion graphics involve very elaborate animation, but if your videos are anything like mine, you spend most of your time just doing simple elements coming on screen and then disappearing. And there's really only so many ways you can do that. You can make things fade in, or slide in, or grow in, and making that look good is more about just putting tiny little touches and flourishes on these simple motions to just make them look a little bit more interesting. So I wanted to show you how I approach secondary motion, where something wobbles or acts springy or bounces in any way. I'm going to keep things super basic, set up a simple HD composition just 4 seconds long, and throw just one element into it, which is the Captain D logo. Let's say this was our shot where we just had to have the logo appear at 1 second in time. Well, the first basic thing I could do is, of course, just set an endpoint for the layer at that point by pressing Alt left bracket. And now if I preview, it just cuts into the shot. It's very primitive. We could add a little bit of interest by maybe making it grow in really quick. So I'll press S to open up the scale property, and on the first frame, I will add a keyframe, set this to 0, maybe go just like 4 frames forward, set this to 100, and now we've got it growing over 4 frames. That's more interesting, but it's a little bit abrupt, so I might want to take that second keyframe and make its curve, which is currently not a curve at all, but just like a linear motion that stops suddenly. I can ease it by changing the keyframe to easy ease or pressing F9, and that adds a little bit of a curve to the motion, so it kind of slows into its final size. We all know this. And now it just looks nicer, but we could give the logo a little bit of a sense of volume and weight if we just let it kind of wobble like this and settle into its final size. And of course there are plugins, or you can just get like a free expression, just Google After Effects expressions, spring or bounce layer or whatever, and you could just plug it into this property, alt-click here and plug in that code, and it will make things bounce without you having to do anything extra. But I find that when I'm doing a bunch of graphics, and this is like one of 50 things I have to do in this shot, and then I have like 20 more shots, I don't want to go digging for an expression, and even if I have one on hand, if I plug it in, the thing is going to bounce in a certain way, maybe too much or too little, and I'll have to adjust a bunch of parameters in there. And if later in my shot I don't want, like I want the logo to maybe like recede to the corner or something, and I don't want it to bounce anymore, I'll have to adjust the expression with some like expression controls, and I'll have to link things to sliders and whatever. So I find that I like to do it with just a little bit of keyframes. So for this kind of wobble, this is what I do. I figure out the timing of the wobble first, and then I figure out the changes in scale. So let me show you what I mean. I know it's gonna vibrate quickly and then slow down. It's that type of motion. So I just create a bunch of spaced out keyframes, and the spacing increases each time. So I'll go from this keyframe, I'll go 1, 2 frames, and I'll add a keyframe. Then I'll go 3 frames, 1, 2, 3, and add another keyframe. The next time I go 4 frames, 1, 2, 3, 4, keyframe. Then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, keyframe. So it's just the space increases by 1 frame every time. Now we have the spacing, but nothing happens because, of course, on every keyframe it says be 100% in size, and that's how we want it to end up. So this last keyframe will be 100, and this first keyframe is at 0, which is correct. But these keyframes in between is where we have to adjust it, and we just have to make it bigger and smaller and bigger and smaller in smaller and smaller increments. So in this initial keyframe here, it's going to overshoot its ultimate size, so I'll just drag it and hold shift so it doesn't distort and just make it a little bit bigger, like this. On the next keyframe, I'm going to make it a little bit smaller, but like less than I made it bigger before. On the next one, I'll make it bigger, but even less than that. And on the final keyframe, or on the penultimate keyframe, I'll shrink it ever so slightly, so it's very subtle. And when I preview, I get this. A nice little satisfying wobble that just gives a lot of interest. It just feels way less mechanical. Now, sometimes you'll find that it looks okay, but something is a little bit off. And I was actually hoping that it would be off, but I'm just so damn good at this that it came out perfect. But if you're making those size changes by hand, you could resize it too much in one of those keyframes and it will just feel unnatural. Well, you don't have to do it by eye. You can use the numbers by, for instance, just deciding on the initial overshoot scale. We know we want it to end up 100%, but the very first overshoot, when it becomes its largest, let's say it was some round number like 120. So we've overshot it by 20%. On the next keyframe, I'll undershoot it by half that, or 10%. In other words, make this 90%. Next, I'll overshoot by half of that, which would be 5%, so 105. And then I have to undershoot by 2.5%. And if your brain is as stupid as mine, you can't do that in your head right away, but you can just type in the actual thing you want, and it will give you 97.5%. Don't tell anyone I can't do that in my head. And then the last keyframe, of course, is 100. So now we preview. It looks about the same, but we can be sure that the wobble decreases at a constant rate. So there you go. Not too much thinking, and it's all contained in keyframes now, and we can go on and do other things with the layer, and it's not going to affect anything. Now we can apply this to a different property. Let's try, instead of growing, let's do like a sliding motion. I'll press Shift P to open up the position property, and I'll just use this as a stencil for the timing, and I'll add a bunch of keyframes in the exact same spots, in the exact same frames. Then I'll get rid of all the scale keyframes, leaving the last one, and then delete the last one so it stays at 100%. I can hide the scale property, Shift S, and let's do the same thing. I'll ease these ones, highlight them, press F9. The first keyframe will be off-screen left, so it'll fly in like this. And so it'll fly in and it will overshoot to the right, then to the left, then to the right, then to the left, and settle down. We could, again, just kind of drag things by eye, or we could try to do math with these numbers, with the x-axis change here. Or with position keyframes, we have another tool, which is to nudge the layer by just using the arrow keys. If I press, for instance, the right arrow key, it'll move it just a little bit, 1 pixel of screen space. I guess because the composition is right now at 50%, it moved it 2 pixels of the composition. But if I zoom into 100% and I press the arrow key, it'll move 1 pixel. And if you hold Shift, however much it moves it, it'll multiply that by 10. So this would be 10 pixels or 20 pixels at 50% size. So we could use this nudging to just do the position change. In other words, we're overshooting to the right here. So let's hold Shift and press the right arrow key 4 times. 1, 2, 3, 4. On the next keyframe, we're going to undershoot, like ricochet backwards, half that. So Shift, left arrow key, 1, 2. On the next keyframe, Shift 1, and then on the next keyframe, I'm not going to hold Shift, I'll just press the left arrow key 5 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because that's half the 10 that the Shift key gives us. And now, let's preview that. We got it flying in from the left and bouncing to a stop. Now this looks nice, but I don't know about you, but to my eye, there's something a little bit off. Let's look at this closer frame by frame. So we got our first frame, it starts in from the left. Goes to the right, and it reaches that first overshoot keyframe. The next thing I expect to happen is for it to go back in the other direction, but it keeps going forward and then suddenly snaps back. Why is that? Well, if I move it up, we can see that the motion path actually shows that it kind of goes forward. So we have our overshoot, and then it overshoots some more and then goes back. And this is because, unlike scale and other properties, the default behavior for position is to create this continuous curve between keyframes, which is something you usually want. If you've got something like wiggling around, you want it to create the most natural motion path that it can. But in this case, we're doing something specific where we don't want it to improvise this way. So I'm going to undo that little repositioning, and I'll get rid of the interpolation by highlighting all the keyframes, right-clicking, going to keyframe interpolation, and then we've got temporal interpolation is what that motion curve we looked at before. This is what controls, whether a keyframe is linear or eased or whatever. We don't want to mess with that, but spatial interpolation is the motion path on the screen. It's set to auto Bezier, which is what we were seeing. I'm going to switch it to linear, say OK, and now we can see that the connection between all the keyframes is straight lines. So now it'll look perfect. That's all there is to it. And the great thing about this is, if it looks good at this speed, you don't have to keep it this exact timing. Now that you've set this up and it looks correct, you can highlight everything and park your cursor at the beginning or the end keyframe, and then just scale it. Just hold Alt and drag it to scale it out, maybe make it longer. So now it'll be slower, but it doesn't look weird. It just looks like a more massive logo, like an object that moves a little bit lazier. Similarly, we could shrink it down and make it snap really fast, and it's almost too fast, but we can add some motion blur, and then that really gives it like a very, almost like an ultra realistic motion of something very tiny. Because if you look closer, like some of these keyframes end up between actual frames, so it looks kind of real, because that's what would happen if you filmed something with a camera. You know, direction changes don't necessarily happen right on a frame. It can happen like while the shutter is closed. So this is the only way you could do this kind of motion, is by doing it slower and then scaling it down. So looks interesting and dynamic. Let me show you one more example. So far we've looked at this like a thing stopping itself and I guess wobbling as its inertia dissipates. But sometimes we get the opposite timing, where things don't go fast and then slow down, but they go slow and then speed up. Like if you snap a ruler against the desk, you know, it kind of goes high and slow and then it speeds up and goes or like just a bouncing ball, I guess. A ball bounces slow and then speeds up as its height decreases. So let's try that kind of motion. I'm gonna delete these keyframes, and then the last one, sitting it back in the middle. I've turned off the motion blur for now. I'll press Command Y and just add a solid and make this like a two-dimensional ground plane onto which the logo is going to bounce as it falls from above, like some sort of 1960s opening credits type of treatment. I will create a position keyframe for the logo, go 4 frames again, let it fall down. It's bouncing from above for 4 frames. Now it's hit the ground. Now it's going to bounce up. So I'm going to give this, like, let's say 6 frames. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now it's going to travel up, but it's going to bounce back down again. So I'm going to do what I did before, but I'm going to do these spacings in pairs. So it's bounced up for 6 frames. Now I'm going to have it bounce down for 6 frames. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then I'm going to bounce up for 5 frames. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Bounce down for 5 frames. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 1. Now when it bounces against the ground, that's a sharp change in direction. It'll bounce and immediately go up. So every other keyframe where it hits the ground is going to stay linear. Every other keyframe where it's bouncing upward is going to be eased. So I'm just going to select every other keyframe like this and press F9, because when it's on the upswing, it's going to rise up and gravity is going to slow it down. So it's going to come to a gradual stop and then reverse direction. But every time it bounces from the ground, it's sharp. And since every time it hits the ground, it's basically this position, we're done with all of these frames. And now all of these in between frames, we're just going to do our nudging trick and adjust these heights. So the first one, I'll do like Shift up arrow 6 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Well, let's do 4. So 5, 4, because it seems like maybe that's too high of a bounce. So I did 4 up. This time it's going to be 2. 1, 2. Next time it's 1. Next time it's without shift 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Next time I guess I can go 1, 2 and then zoom in to 50% and do 1 more. So that's like 2.5. And then on the final one, I'll just round it down to just 1 nudge because this is just a cartoon. So I'll highlight my keyframes again. I will check that the interpolation is linear, and it's not. So let's do that. And let's preview. All right. So that looks all right. The only thing that looks off to me now is that compared to this bouncing, the initial landing is very fast. Like it lands like it's been falling off a 5-story building, and then it bounces like it's on the moon, very slow and lazy. So maybe what I'll do is just take these keyframes, everything after the first one, and move them out a little bit like this. Let's see if that, yeah, I think that looks more consistent. Now it does look like a bounce in slow motion, but again, now that we've set it up how we want it, we can now just shrink it down a bit and have it look how we want it to look. And I can turn the motion blur back on, and we've got a nice little bounce. So I think these examples give you the idea for the approach, and you could probably figure out the same type of philosophy for other kinds of natural secondary kind of motion, like for instance some kind of like pendulum swing or something. You know, you could do the same thing. Just figure out how does the timing consistently change, and then just do these little adding and subtracting tricks to add that little flourish. And again, it's just a couple of keyframes. Now you don't have to think about it, and it's not dependent on any expressions or any plugins. It's just good old-fashioned hand keyframed animation using advanced motion graphic software. So yeah, go ahead and give it a try, and thanks for watching. Boing.